Hello. The previous lecture was on the French Revolution, and we took it up more or less to the time of Napoleon. Let's now spend this lecture examining the life and the success and failure of Napoleon himself. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica in 1769 to a relatively poor family, but not totally impoverished. Corsica is one of the islands off the coast of southern France in the corner where it is near Italy. And Corsica had a strong Italian background for many, many years, but had recently been moved into France as a part of the French nation. And therefore, the people in Corsica were citizens of France. That allowed Napoleon to attend a military school in France where he was quite successful. He was a very good student, especially in mathematics. And that excellence in mathematics led him into artillery, because artillery is a mathematical science of warfare. You know, you calculate the angles and so on. And therefore, he became an artillery officer. Napoleon first showed his creative capability during the early stages of the French Revolution, where the French people had been attacked by foreign entities. One of those entities was Great Britain. And the English fleet had sailed into the southern French port of Toulon, still a major harbor in France today. The city of Toulon, the harbor of Toulon, has the city around it, but there are some high cliffs surrounding the harbor. The citizens of Toulon had begun a riot, and that riot was being supplied by the British fleet. The riot was against the revolutionary regime in Paris. It was felt that if the British fleet was driven out of the harbor of Toulon, the supplies would be cut off and the revolt would collapse. Therefore, Napoleon was given the mission of accomplishing exactly what I said. He went down to Toulon, saw that if he took his artillery pieces up onto the heights above the harbor, he would be able to drive the British ships from the harbor, and that's what he did. It was very successful, and he was able to quell the rebellion. For that success, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of brigadier general. Now, you might think that's a very fast promotion, and certainly it is, but remember this. The army in France had been staffed as officers almost entirely by royalty, and the royalty were being killed. The date here is 1793, and that's in the midst of the Reign of Terror. And therefore, Napoleon was promoted quickly because the officers were just simply being killed. Therefore, another year later, or 2 years later, in 1795, Napoleon was in Paris, and there was another riot against the government. In this case, it was a riot against the Directory, because the people were angered that the Directory had not yet been able to solve the problem of exorbitant prices for bread. Therefore, they stormed the palace where the National Assembly was meeting. And Napoleon was sent to quell this counter-revolutionary riot. He set up his artillery pieces in front of the palace. Palace is downtown Paris, near the Louvre. It's actually overlooking the same park as the Louvre. It's called the Tuileries Palace. And Napoleon, therefore, fired into the revolutionary crowd. He fired grape shot. Grape shot is small pieces of metal that, when they are fired out of a cannon, are very effective against personnel. When asked why he did that, he said, "I needed to quell the riot, and so I gave them a whiff of grape shot." Very famous statement. Because of his success and immediate success in this area in quelling the riot, he was promoted to commander of the interior and the army of Italy. That is, the army that was going to attack Italy. At this moment, both Italy and Prussia and Great Britain were attacking France, and they had to stop them. They believed that the greater threat was in the north of France, and therefore the very best generals were sent to the north. But Napoleon was given command over the army that was going to attack, or that was going to repel the attack of the Italians in the south. Napoleon's campaign against Italy, or in Italy, was tremendously successful. The Italian army, that is the French army in Italy, was fighting the Austrians and the Italians. At this time, Italy was a province of Austria. At least northern Italy was a province of Austria. And therefore, the battle raged through northern Italy. And Napoleon was able to continually drive back the army of the Austrians. In fact, he drove it out of Italy, and then he continued to drive it across Austria until he got all the way to the eastern side of Austria, to the very gates of Vienna, when the Austrians capitulated and a peace treaty was signed. Napoleon was the most successful general in all of France. You can see why he was tremendously loved by the French people. He had saved France from this foreign invasion. Napoleon was then asked what he thought would be the appropriate thing to do to battle against Great Britain. Remember now, Great Britain and Prussia were attacking in the north. Napoleon felt that the north could take care of itself, at least at this moment, but he could really hurt Great Britain if he were to attack British colonies and the ability of Britain to communicate with their most prized colony, which was India. Therefore, Napoleon suggested that he take an army to Egypt, and by conquering Egypt, he would wrest control of the land route between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, that is, over what is now the Suez Peninsula, or where the Suez Canal is built today. And he did that. So Napoleon took an army into Egypt, and there he fought several battles and won them all. Interestingly enough, along with his army, Napoleon took 150 scientists. They were people who began the study of ancient Egypt, looking at ways that they could interpret hieroglyphs and what the tombs were all about. No one up until this time had studied Egypt in a systematic way. This really was the beginning of archaeology. And Napoleon was responsible for bringing the scientists who did that study. Many people think that Napoleon took this trip to Egypt not so much as a method of defeating the British. That probably was part of the reason, but they also believed that Napoleon saw himself as Alexander the Great, and that he wanted to conquer Egypt and then move eastward as Alexander the Great had done. Napoleon was, if nothing else, a very, very proud man. Was this creative? Certainly it was in Napoleon's time. Some people would argue that it was foolhardy and not creative, but it was successful except for this problem. The French fleet was commanded in such a way that they allowed themselves to be trapped in a harbor, and most of the fleet was sunk when the British ships trapped them there. It was devastating for Napoleon's army in Egypt, because without the French fleet, they would be unable to get supplies and they would inevitably be defeated, although they won the battles, but they could not continue their presence in Egypt without supplies. Napoleon realized that this was going to be the case, and therefore, to avoid any feeling or any actuality of defeat in a battle, Napoleon left his army, reassigned himself to France, where he said that he needed to help with the invasion in other parts of France. Napoleon returned to France and left his army in Egypt, and the army was eventually defeated and driven out of Egypt. Many of the artifacts that were obtained by these archaeologists were then possessed, repossessed, if you like, or expropriated by the British. And therefore, the Rosetta Stone, for instance, which was found by Napoleon's people, ended up in the British Museum because it was part of the victories of the war. When Napoleon returned to France from his escapade in Egypt, it became obvious that the French government was in trouble. The Directory, as we have already noted in a previous lecture, was unable to control inflation. They were unable to give vision to the people. It was ruled by committee in its worst sense, and therefore the Directory decided that they would do something, and it was at this time that they decided that they would choose consuls to run the government. Napoleon was asked to be the first consul, and he immediately eliminated all other consuls. Therefore, he essentially took total control of the government. The people were quite happy with it because they wanted a strong leader. Napoleon was very popular, and obviously he had the support of the people. In fact, he took over control of the government, and then he immediately went out for a plebiscite ratifying that he would be the sole leader of the government, and the people gave him tremendous ratification support. Napoleon was also supported by the army. They had great prestige under his victories, and therefore he had control over the two most important parts of the French nation. Napoleon was very successful as first consul. He did not exert power just for power's sake. He saw himself as a servant of the people. He modified his stance toward the people by saying, "I am the first servant of the state," whereas Louis XIV said, "I am the state." Augustus Caesar, remember, in ancient history said, "I am the first citizen." So it's clear that Napoleon is distancing himself from Louis XIV and drawing himself close to Caesar Augustus, which is the model of the Roman Republic. Now, it's true that Caesar Augustus was the first emperor, and as we will see, Napoleon's modeling of Caesar Augustus eventually led to Napoleon declaring himself emperor as well. What reforms or changes did Napoleon make during the time that he was first consul? He wrote the French legal code. It's called the Code Napoleon, and it is still the basis of the French legal system. It's even the basis of the legal system in the state of Louisiana in the United States, because its legal system was adopted while Louisiana was part of France. Napoleon organized the Bank of France, and with that organization and the control over the monetary policy of the country, Napoleon was finally able to defeat inflation in France and control the price of bread. Napoleon did this by increasing taxes and by increasing control of the government over almost all facets of French life. That was done by multiplying the bureaucracy. He did that by sending bureaucrats throughout France and then controlling the action of the bureaucrats centrally. So France was becoming very much a centralized country. Napoleon realized that many of the people of France, especially those who lived outside of Paris, were still strong Catholics by both practice and temperament. And therefore, Napoleon wanted to heal the rift that had occurred with the Catholic Church back in the early days of the French Revolution. So Napoleon began a dialogue with the Pope, and it was agreed that the Catholic Church would be reinstated as the official church of the French Republic. There were some negotiations about ownership of church property and about payment of priests out of government funds. But in general, the relationships between the Catholic Church and Napoleon were good. And so this rift with the Catholic Church had been healed. Napoleon was enlightened. And by that I mean he was well educated, he was philosophical in his thinking, he believed in education. Therefore, Napoleon made education compulsory throughout France. Most of the people from this time on in France became literate. Napoleon gave strong support to science. Notice that when he went to Egypt, he took the scientists with him that was part of his exploration group. In fact, look at what Napoleon said about science when he was inducted into the French National Institute. He said, "The truest conquests, the only ones that give rise to no regrets, are those gained over ignorance. The most honorable as well as the most useful activity of nations is to contribute to the advancement of human knowledge. The real strength of the French Republic should henceforth lie in its determination to possess every new idea without a single exception." Well, Napoleon was certainly an enlightened ruler, but he also had a feeling of wanting control, and therefore in 1804, Napoleon asked the Senate to make him their emperor, which they gladly did, frankly. He wanted to increase his presence in America. He saw an empire being more than just France. It was France plus royal possessions, colonies, and other places, and they had possession of Louisiana in the United States and Haiti. So Napoleon sent an army to attempt to quell a riot that was going on at that time in Haiti, and then he was going to go up to Louisiana and install the army in Louisiana and expand throughout the Louisiana territory and reestablish a major presence for France in the New World. Sadly, it was not successful. The French army got tied down in their battle in Haiti. They were destroyed with disease and the surprising ferocity of the Haitian revolutionists, and therefore Napoleon's army never did come to Louisiana. They went back to France, and at that point Napoleon realized he needed money and needed it quickly in order to fight Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain. And therefore Napoleon was motivated to sell Louisiana at a bargain basement price to the United States. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was president, and he took up that offer and purchased Louisiana for the United States. Napoleon still had the desire for territorial expansion, not necessarily overseas, but he wanted to expand within Europe. And therefore he started to push into Holland and the Low Countries, wanted to push into Italy, into Spain, into Germany, and all of those expansions of French territory and possessions of neighboring areas led him to become disliked by others in Europe. No one likes their country taken over, and Napoleon, even though he was bringing the concept of republicanism, really wanted all of these to be under his personal control, and therefore he did not establish republics in all of those. He allowed monarchies to continue, and he put his own family in as kings of these territories. It was a great disappointment to some. Beethoven, for instance, had composed a symphony called the Eroica, Symphony Number 3, and he dedicated this symphony to Napoleon in Napoleon's early career. Now, when expansion was Napoleon's foremost thought, Beethoven, as well as most others, were disappointed, and Beethoven showed his disappointment by scratching out the dedication to Napoleon and stating that Eroica was dedicated to someone who was previously a great man. Here we see a map of Europe, and it shows the tremendous power and expansion that occurred under Napoleon. Clearly, most of Western Europe, with the exception of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, were under the control of Napoleon. Napoleon then started to push against Austria-Hungary, and he was successful. And then you can see Russia lies on the eastern border of Austria, and that is when Napoleon decided that he would enter Russia as well. It was terrible. Well, Napoleon also decided that he would attempt an invasion of England. If he could remove the British from the group that had assembled, the coalition that had assembled to fight him, he would break the coalition. In order to invade Great Britain, he obviously needed a fleet to get across the English Channel. Therefore, Napoleon decided that he would combine the French fleet that was largely in the Mediterranean, and he would pull the French fleet and combine it with the Spanish fleet. Remember, Napoleon had taken control of Spain. And together, that combined fleet would be sufficient that he would be able to invade England. Therefore, he called that fleet to come from the Mediterranean area, southern Atlantic area, that is off the coast of Spain, and move northward into the Channel. But the British were cognizant of what Napoleon was doing, and they sent their fleet to confront the fleet that had been assembled by Napoleon. Those two fleets met off the coast of Spain, and they had a great battle called the Battle of Trafalgar. It was caused because Napoleon not only wanted to invade Great Britain, but he wanted to blockade Great Britain and eliminate it from trading with the continent. It was called the Continental System. And so there was a double purpose: to establish a blockade and then eventually to invade Great Britain. The people of Great Britain were alarmed. Obviously there was worry, and so this fleet of British ships was highly motivated under their admiral, Lord Admiral Nelson. And as they met, Nelson did a very creative maneuver. He did what is called allowing them to cross the T. Here's a little map of the Battle of Trafalgar, and let me explain what happened. The British fleet was separated into two lines parallel to each other, and the Spanish and French fleet sailed in front of them. Now, normally that would be very, very dangerous because the broadside of the ship is obviously the side where the guns are located. And the broadside of the Spanish and French fleet is facing the British. And so the French could fire at the British and knock out the ships one by one as they sailed into the proximity. Hence, Nelson allowed a terrible situation to occur. But what he realized is that initially the French fleet was out of range in shelling the British, and so they could not quite reach them. And when they got close enough to engage, that is, the distance was close enough, the British fleet would be able to disrupt the formation of the French fleet, and because they had better sailing capabilities, the ships were able to move in the winds of that day in a better way. They were able to defeat the French fleet, and that's exactly what happened. One of the fun things about it is as the British sailed toward the French, it could be heard that they sang this song, and the song was Rule Britannia. Listen to this song and you can imagine the reaction of the French sailors as they heard this song being sung, and of the British sailors as they sung it, and they gave themselves this boost of enthusiasm. This song, by the way, is still sung every year in memorial of the greatness of Great Britain and its empire. Here's some ships that show they're at the museum, the Naval Museum in Portsmouth, England. The ship that we are looking at is the HMS Victory. It was the flagship of Lord Admiral Nelson. As Nelson was standing on the deck supervising the warfare, he was shot by a French soldier from one of the neighboring French ships, and Nelson died. But here we can see Nelson's suite, a group of bunks where the sailors slept, and also the area of the guns on the deck. Well, Napoleon's continental system of boycotting English goods was a failure. He tried to force allegiances. Because the fleet had failed, he then tried to force, by diplomatic means, all of the countries in Europe to not trade with Great Britain. Most of them were under such tight control that Napoleon was able to force them to do that, but Russia refused. That angered Napoleon, and therefore he decided that he would attack Russia. When Napoleon attacked Russia, he did so through Austria. He was able to conquer Austria and win, and here we see on the map that Austria fell to Napoleon, and then Napoleon began his invasion of Moscow. It proved to be a disaster. Napoleon did occupy Moscow, but he did that late in the year, and Moscow had been stripped of its provisions. Napoleon's supply chains were so long that he was unable to get food to his troops, and realizing this, Napoleon began a disastrous retreat. The retreat was disastrous because early snows bogged the French army down, and that made them subject to attacks by the Russians and revolts within the French army, because it was not an army composed of only Frenchmen. Napoleon had forced Prussians and Austrians to join him in that army, and therefore Napoleon was not able to survive. The occupation of Moscow and the retreat from Moscow is commemorated in a piece by Tchaikovsky called the 1812 Overture. In this piece you can hear the cannons, you can hear the French theme and the Russian theme, and it has become a wonderful patriotic piece for the Russian people. Let's listen to just a little bit of it as we contemplate the retreat from Moscow that Napoleon had to take. After Napoleon's defeat and the devastation of his army, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and he was made Emperor of Elba, a very small island not too far from Corsica. And then he escaped from Elba, and for 100 days he returned to France as its ruler. The army supported him strongly, and he then decided that he would go to war against the coalition that had reformed to squash Napoleon's new adventuresome. Napoleon then fought the Battle of Waterloo, where he was defeated. And after that defeat, he was sent to St. Helena, a little island down in the middle of the Atlantic. A Congress was then assembled in Vienna to try and put Europe back together again. And what they did is said, we're going to go back to the way it was before the Revolution of France. They, of course, were not able to do that, but they tried very hard. And the monarchy in France was reestablished. Monarchies were reestablished throughout Europe. But the people of France remember Napoleon. Look here at the tomb of Napoleon in Paris. You can see how they loved him. Was Napoleon creative? I think so. He did marvelous things for the French people. Thank you very much.